Good afternoon, everyone. Well, today we have a very special session. For a course planning for Megaregion course, and special session for our center event. And so great to have two guests from Georgetown. Our connection started last year, right? The Georgetown Bicycle Master Plan. Some of you worked on the project last year. Now today we have two guest speakers in our center, not talking about Georgetown Bicycle Plan, but the issue, topic, rail in Texas, which is directly relevant to the spring course planning for Megaregion course, and then potentially relevant to the research some of you are working on or will continue to work on related to your PR or thesis. The two guests, Ray Miller, transportation planner at City of Georgetown, and Maddie, Maddie Akers from Georgetown. I guess Ray, you'll be speaking mostly, right? Correct. Today. Correct. Ray has a very rich experience. If you read his CV, I emailed you yesterday or the day before yesterday, and he has worked on the positions, rail section in TxDOT, and director of MPO, and then several other professional positions, and now transportation planner at City of Georgetown. So, Maddie was or still is kind of our coordinator for the Georgetown Bicycle Master Plan that we're working on. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time to come to our center here, giving a talk. And also thanks to Inessa and Nicole for arranging the lunch.
It was very good.
Right. Great. Well, let's welcome Ray.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank Dr. Ming for the invitation to come speak with you. And this is kind of perfect. I love a just casual conversation. The PowerPoint is hopefully just to trigger some questions. So I hope to go through it kind of quick, and then we can just dive into any topic you like. If I use an acronym or say anything, I guess y'all are familiar with MPOs and CAMPO, perhaps. Please stop, or if you have any questions along the way, just raise your hand or yell out at me. Say, hey, dummy, I got a question, and that'll work for me. So I took a look, and if you had a chance to see the outline, I touched on a little bit of everything regarding to transportation and the Texas Triangle. So as you know, it's currently outlined by the interstates of I-10 to the south and the east-west corridor, then I-45 connecting Dallas to Fort Worth, and Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, and then I-35 coming down connecting Austin and San Antonio, creating that triangle. And as most of you know, that has started out, we've had several programs looking at connecting our cities. There's the Farm to Market program, there was the State Highway program, the U.S. Highway program, and of course the Interstate Highway program. And we have a lot of major areas in this triangle. When I was going through this presentation, I never really thought about it, that what is all centered in this mega region, meaning Waco, Temple, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, San Marcos, Austin, Houston, Galveston, and of course, A&M in the center. I didn't go to A&M, so I just figured that'd be a good jab. I use Calvin and Hobbes, kind of my brain trust sometimes, just to put things in perspective. But transportation, I think these days is a lot like this. You have no idea what's going on some of our roadways, and the more I think about it, maybe autonomous vehicles will take the human factor out of things and maybe make things safer. But I went back to the 1950s, started out with the interstate highway system, because that was really the big push to look at connecting, having these free-flowing, less access, providing to get you to point A and point B, to connect our larger regions. As you can see, there was a pretty hefty in dollars at that time. 26 billion in 1950 was probably a pretty hefty price tag. And as you know, as it relates to this, as I mentioned, it's I-10, I-45, and again, I-35. So I started with the Department of Transportation in 1991. There's probably been several things between 1950 and 1991 that have occurred. But just as going back, that time period from 91 to 97 to almost 2000, there was a lot of different changes in the transportation field, starting with the Federal Highway Act, which every year, if you pay attention, has a different crazy acronym. This one was surfaced related to intermodal. That was the big push, creating these intermodal centers, and it was referred to as ICE-T. The other thing that this transportation bill did was it linked the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 to transportation, to where you had to start looking at how projects interacted with the environment, the pollution, how it contributed to ozone. And of course, we have currently 5 non-attainment areas. I think San Antonio is still going through their designation, which would be number 6. And we'll have to see how this summer goes for Austin, because Austin is teetering right now. And it also started looking at corridors of national importance. I picked 19 and 20 because that turned into what was called Interstate 69, which kind of brushes the triangle a little bit. But that was also another major push that started with ICE-T, was these highways of national significance, and looking at planning and in some respects creating these super corridors at that time. The pink and red outlines what is I-69. It connects with Canada through Michigan. And then as you see, as we get into Texas, it branches off, kind of creates a stool or a seat. So this is based on what is currently US 59. 59 goes from Laredo through Victoria to Houston on up to Texarkana. And then right there in Victoria, it splits off for the first time and hits US 77, which goes down towards Brownsville and the Valley. And then further out, it connects with 281, which also goes down to Harlingen, San Benito. And again, the whole thing was to create that connectivity through our state, connecting Canada with Mexico, and all based on the whole NAFTA trade idea. Again, during this time period, we also saw what was called the Austin-San Antonio Regional Commuter Rail Project. This was the first thought of doing a regional rail project that connected San Antonio with Houston. The initiative has had several stop and starts. It later became the beginnings of Lone Star Rail, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. You know, it's just to offer an alternative mode of transportation to get folks off of I-35 and to help with congestion on I-35 was the whole premise, was those people that commute every day would have a different option of transportation. We also had a talk of the I-35 bypass that started in the early 90s, which has formed out and taken shape as State Highway 130. A lot of folks don't know this started out as really a truck bypass. That was the original study that was done with a lot of truck intercepts north of Georgetown, getting feedback from truckers if they would use an alternative route, if they perhaps would pay a toll. But it has merged into and turned into what I think is more of just a commuter facility. It has some through traffic on it, but it's more of a circulation, much like MOPAC is for most of Austin. It opened, or parts of it started open in 2012, and you can see some of the numbers associated with that. And as I was mentioning to someone here earlier, that I didn't know this till I was reading up on it some more, that the south legs, which is below 71 going to San Antonio, is the highest speed limit rated facility in the nation, at over 85 miles an hour that it's signed. And here kind of outlines that route. Again, the whole premise was to get that traffic that is going through the area out the I-35 corridor. The other big project that took hold at this time too was what was called the TGV, which is the French company. They were the first ones looking at connecting the Texas Triangle by high-speed rail. This project began to gain some steam, but with any large infrastructure project, they started to get a lot of opposition from large to medium to large landowners. The landowners were mainly looking at, well, you're going to cut my property in half. How do I get my livestock across to the other side? What do I do with the remainders? What will the swoosh of a high-speed train, how will it impact my cattle, my livestock? All those things started to come up. But one of the biggest things it had is it had some financial trouble starting at the top, kind of misspending of money and wasting money on things they shouldn't be. The other player in this was Southwest Airlines. They're a homegrown airline for Texas. At that time, they were providing trips only in Texas. That was their bread and butter, was local trips. And so they were lobbying against, at the legislature, against TGV because that was their role now, was providing those jump trips. Then also Southwest, I like to joke about, they came out at that time with $49 one-way fares. I'd like to see that happen again, but that was another big push to kind of close the door on TGV. But its financial issues and mismanagement of money was its real biggest downfall. Jumping forward to one of my favorite topics was Trans-Texas Corridors. This was kind of the thoroughfare plan for the state of Texas. This started with Governor Perry. If you look at the hierarchy of TxDOT, Governor Perry sits and appoints the governor appoints all of the transportation commissioners. That's a board or body that oversees all the operations of TxDOT. So while a lot of TxDOT engineers weren't too happy with this plan, it got pushed from the top down. And it was a network of 400 lane miles of roadways with super corridors. And the big downfall that we'll talk about a little bit more was this 1,200 foot of right-of-way. A typical interstate runs or ranges from 200 foot to 400 foot of right-of-way, sometimes 600 foot at the intersections. If you look at what the right-of-way is, you can go down pretty much any roadway or any U.S. highway or farm to market road, and if you want to look where the power lines are located, that's typically the edge of your right-of-way. So that whole right-of-way is not paved because it will carry drainage, utilities, and other items. Even in your local streets, most yards have still 10 feet of right-of-way that people take care of and mow, but it's actually owned by the city or whatever jurisdiction. So this was looking at connecting or carrying all the different modes of transportation within that 1,200 foot corridor. Again, intended to route long distance, much like the interstate highway system, connecting all of our transportation or population centers, and looking at also providing an access for utilities. That was one of the other big pushes, was that they'd be able to have an area to take utility lines from all the West Texas wind farms and route them down this Trans-Texas corridor right away, so they didn't have to go out and buy or go through condemnation to get utility easements across large properties. Here's kind of how that map laid out. The orange were kind of the priority corridors that came out of that. One of the corridors we talked about was I-69. That was made a part of this as well. Hopefully that's clear. This was kind of the schematic of what that corridor would look like. Separated truck or high-speed truck, as they called it, lanes, vehicle lanes, commuter rail, high-speed freight rail, and as well as plenty of room for utilities.
You must have been a holder like me, because those are hard to find when you look for them now. But a few of us got PowerPoint, so I have one from Amadeo Science. So
Yes, Amadeo was pulling his hair out during that time.
I know. So
At this time, I was the MPO director in Victoria, so we had a split in Victoria, and my district engineer, which was Lonnie Gregorczyk.
Oh, Lonnie, yes.
When we had our meetings in Victoria, he got badgered and hammered. Much like TGV, the population, property owners, cities, all came out in kind of arms when they saw this swath of land. That's all they saw on the map, was that we got 1,200 foot of right-of-way that's going to come through my property. It's going to wipe out my 5-generation family farm or my ranch, all of those things into it. And as you can see, we had 2 public meetings. This first one was just kind of a question and answer meeting, but it lasted for like 5 hours or longer. And the second one was an actual public hearing where they were taking actual testimony on going through the environmental process for trans-Texas corridors, at least for the segment of I-69. But in 2009, TxDOT started to, with all the pressure that was coming out, phase that out and just went back to how we do things, and that's creating separate corridors for all the different modes, all the different utilities. And then finally, Federal Highway Administration issued a no action, and then the legislature kind of closed the door on it with House Bill 1201 in 2011, said that we're not going to even talk about it any longer. They'll come back.
Well, it actually came out of an idea, a piece of research that Michael Buss at City of Lakeway did. It was looking at bypasses in the future after natural pass.
Yep.
Just the fact that suddenly I-35 was so busy, and even the ports were getting more trade was coming in, so it was like, so they looked at creating bypasses, and the discussion was, we don't have enough money to maintain these in the future. We barely have enough to build them, so we've got to think innovatively. And they know a little bit about, I did a presentation speaking on the gas tax and how we run things. And so the idea in this piece of research was that, well, if you're looking to do something, could we be a bit innovative? Could we share some costs? So put utilities in the right way. They're already going in there, to think about space, and yeah, maybe separate out different modes, especially maybe separate out the trucks. So because then if you separate out the trucks, you can build the concrete lanes for the regular cars to a different standard for those trucks if they're heavier.
Yep.
And then the idea was, because TGV was still around, and could we do some help with connectivity for rail, but every type of rail, not just high-speed rail, but even connectivity to the rail. And they came up in that piece of research, I think the right-of-way in total was like 610, and Rob Harrison went down to meet with the governor's guide in 2002 on transportation. And the next thing was like the schematic in the research report had a mirror put here.
When we were looking at the initial corridors from ICE-T, we had developed a 600-foot right-of-way, and that was what the standard was. It was palatable to the public, but when they saw this 1,200-foot right-of-way, that's when they just raised their arms up in opposition. The other thing that was kind of a fault of TxDOT at this time, as well as the consultants working with them, is when they were talking to the public, they would say, well, it's just a line on a map, and we might not use all that right-of-way, and that still didn't sit very well with the public. Here you are going to take an easement across their land and say, well, maybe one day you can lease it back from us, was some of the conversations that they were having. So it really stirred the public up quite a bit, and there was, every meeting across the state was 1,000 or more in attendance. Yes, ma'am. They had several different consultings working on different pieces. They created out different segments and created these project teams that worked on the different segments. Some of them were Jacobs Engineering, HNTB, some of the bigger consulting firms. TxDOT uses that a lot now. They'll have what they call a general engineering contractor, and it's a big engineering firm that oversees multiple projects. I'll talk a little bit about Mobility 35, and there's one project that's overseeing it, but different engineers are working on different segments. Texas High-Speed Rail moving forward, we're starting to see the initiative for high-speed rail come back into the picture. Right now, the one that has what I appear to see is the most momentum is what's called Texas Central Rail. They call it Texas Central, but this is the link between Dallas and Houston in East Texas. And for those that make that trip fairly regularly, this approximately 240-mile trip speeds up to 205 miles an hour, so making a 90-minute trip to Houston or Dallas. And then you also have it connecting into the Dallas light rail that could take you over to Fort Worth as well. But just imagine sitting back, instead of taking 3 hours, you're now taking 90 minutes. You can be productive. And their departure times would be every 30 minutes. So this would be a very active line. And here's kind of a pullout of where that line is anticipated. Again, a large infrastructure project, a lot of opposition from landowners. But recently, it's, again, gained some momentum. They picked a company to start looking at designing, slated to start construction in 2019. We'll see if that happens, because they're still waiting on, before any project that looks at using federal money to get started, they have to go through the environmental process and get a record of decision. Is it an impact or not an impact to the environment? And that's slated currently for about March 2020. So they can't actually start construction until they get that decision from EPA and from the Federal Highway Administration. But you can see, look at some of the jobs that it would generate, and would be a long-lasting project. The other one is the Texas-Oklahoma Passenger Rail Study. We call it TOPPERS. And this is looking at connecting Oklahoma and Texas, and actually even a leg going all the way into Monterrey, Mexico. But it would parallel I-35. So here we're coming back with that whole triangle, but now we're taking on different pieces. When I left the rail division in 2016 at TxDOT, they were just starting to look at some other east-west corridors. Would it be I-10 or would it be US 290 coming out of Austin and going into Houston? But their study was completed in November, and it showed that there could be multiple options for high-speed rail along this corridor. And here's kind of what that would look like, and then perhaps fan out as it gets past San Antonio into different legs. But the ultimate would be going all the way down to Laredo and then making a link all the way down into Monterey. So the latest phase determined that it could feasibly handle rail service, looking at speeds of 220 miles an hour along this rail line. Also determined that passenger rail into Monterey, Mexico would be feasible. And then also showed some, I think where those fingers came off, you would look at some kind of improved Amtrak service coming out of San Antonio. I forgot to take out your variety of options.
That's okay.
That brings us to more modern day, well, not modern day, the other two are very modern, but Lone Star Rail. As I mentioned earlier, this started in the 1990s as what was called the Austin-San Antonio Interregional Commuter Rail Project. And Lone Star Rail had a board, had an executive director. They were gaining some support. They were gaining a lot of steam, moving forward. And when they go through a process, or you go through the environmental clearance, you have to look at a variety of options, alternatives, and look at, and one of those is even a no-build scenario in some cases. But we looked at running 117 miles of track, more than 30 trains a day running between Georgetown and South San Antonio is where it would terminate and then come back, with stops in Hayes, San Marcos, New Braunfels. And here is kind of how that would look like. The one alternative that stood out, or the one corridor that stood out the most, was the existing Union Pacific rail line. If you're familiar, that's the rail line that runs down Mopac right now and crosses Town Lake, and it parallels I-35 the rest of the way. But three things came together to derail this effort. As I mentioned earlier, this project has stopped and started several different times. So in 10 years, there's been over $30 million spent on planning and engineering and modeling and conceptual diagrams. And this started to lose some lack of support with those people that were helped sponsoring the program. One of the biggest being CAMPO, which is the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. But the real nail in the coffin was UP. Shortly after, a group of us met with Union Pacific at their spring headquarters and talked about trying to work with them on the UP rail line. They came out with issued a letter to TxDOT and to Lone Star Rail saying, not now, not ever, can you use our rail line. That one of the things they stated was the need for on-demand reliability. Well, all of their customers in this corridor are all very large aggregate and limestone producing companies. Rail does not go door to door anymore. It's not an on-demand service. So this was just kind of their way of saying, we want control of our rail line and nobody else can be on it. So it's about looked at $2 billion would be part of the price tag to this, but Campo came out and decided to vote unanimously to remove it from their long-range plan. I don't think the San Antonio MPO moved it out, but they kept in there, working with some type of rail option like that. But Campo completely removed it from their plan, and that kind of pushed Lone Star Rail to the side. And here lately, we keep talking about this corridor, not so much the other ones, but there's been a study that came out, Capital Alamo Connection Study. I put a link in the handouts if you have them or if you already have it, about the study. And just to summarize, it talks about the corridor, talks about relieving congestion, offering different modes, and it really just says that we need to use everything in the toolkit to work on transportation in this corridor. So it's kind of a restatement of 20 years or more, 25 years worth of projects and studies. It all said the same thing. And they had another effort to do that. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but and here's some other things. Mobility 35 is a really good website that talks about the I-35 corridor. It's broken into segments, and then you can see all the different projects that are ongoing. If any of you have driven to Dallas on I-35 and gone through Temple, you've seen how much of a disaster area that has been in regards to transportation and getting through there. Well, we're fixing to do that in Georgetown, so you may want to stay off I-35. We have 5 overpasses that we're fixing to start construction. So one of them will be a city project. It's called Northwest Boulevard. It'll create a northern bypass or northern east-west route. Then we have Williams Drive, State Highway 29, Leander Road, and Westinghouse. It'll be a succession of about 10 years worth of construction projects. If you ever want to talk or look at, we were talking a little bit earlier about project delivery. One of the biggest things that a lot of folks say, well, why don't you just go out and build it? When you're using federal funding, you have to go through the NEPA process, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And you have to look at a variety of scenarios, a variety of alternatives, including a no-build scenario. And going through that process can take 10 to 15 years. And if it's TxDOT or another state agency looking at doing a roadway project, the big kicker here is until they get a record of decision or go through that process, they cannot start buying right-of-way. So if you look at State Highway 620 or Ranch Road 620 from 183 to Lakeway, there's been several scenarios of doing a decked, elevated section through there. Well, because TxDOT doesn't have land use authority or land use power, all that property has developed. So when they go to do an improvement, and we're seeing this a lot in Austin and other metropolitan areas, is that the buying of the right-of-way can actually be more expensive now than just the project itself. And it's a dilemma, but a lot of cities do adopt a thoroughfare plan, and they try to get the right-of-way through what is called the subdivision process. It's a legal platting process, and if you have set up in your code of ordinances what different roadways should look like, you can actually get right-of-way through that process. But a lot of that part of 620 was unincorporated for a while until it finally got incorporated by Leander and Cedar Park and the City of Austin. So that's talks about NEPA. Some other things that are in discussion is congestion pricing. More or less you pay for the time of day that you're traveling a roadway. Maybe that will entice folks to use alternative modes of transportation or to get off. It's more expensive to travel between 4 and 6 or 7 and 9 in the mornings. So it's just some of those things have been talked about. Yes, ma'am.
So I know TxDOT can now approve their own NEPA documents. It doesn't have to go through EPA. They have authority to do that now.
They can go through the Federal Highway Administration is what has the final say.
Have you noticed any sort of improvement in the time it takes to do stuff?
It's gotten a little bit better. When I started in '91, looking at a conceptual idea or a schematic and getting the project started was about 18 years. It's now down to about 10 to 12 years. So they try to work on streamlining and expediting the process, getting everybody together at the table, which is TCEQ, Fish and Wildlife, the Army Corps of Engineers for any bodies of water or streams, historical societies, going through that, all of that. They try to get them all at the table. You still see those silos, especially with Fish and Wildlife and the Army Corps of Engineers, that, yeah, we want to play, but they don't really want to play. So it's getting better, but that's just the part of using it. State Highway 130 is a very good example of private funding and how fast they could move that project along. They still have to get permits for crossing streams and navigable waters and have to do some due diligence as far as environmental clearance, but they can start buying right-of-way. If they had a corridor designated, they can go start buying right-of-way and start construction. And that's literally what they were doing, and they got a piece bought, and they would start constructing and buying in front of it and moving forward. And that was constructed in, what, 4 years or less, if I'm not mistaken, at least the northern part.
The need for assignment though is cutting down time within the DOT. Because previously you had to wait for Federal Highway to come back to give you responses to draft your study. And so California got need for assignment about 8 years ago, and so they had to do every year like a full auditing process review of DOT on this. So they were finding they were cutting just the agency time and carrying the initial documents had been cut by about 16 months, which is huge when you're cutting that out of that whole process. And California was estimating more, but it was costing them money because they were having to ramp up on FTEs because every audit that got done, they didn't have enough people to actually do paperwork. So Sue Tice was saying, who's the deputy director of EMD division, that she was expected to do something like that. And so when we did that project on media assignment, and we developed the training modules, they were seeing about a 3 to 4 month reduction right there, and that was still in the baby steps of doing it. And they had their first audit while they were doing that piece of research. So theoretically, Ray's right, it should slow down and not, and that part of the process is sometimes they have to wait 3-4 months for Federal Highway to come back on an initial draft, be told you've got all the right things in, and now they're doing the final draft to submit that back in.
Yeah.
So when you add all those time tensions and add it in, if you're waiting 3 to 4 months for a reply back, to know have you put the right stuff in to pass muster that they're going to sign, they're going to agree with your determination, and there's no real instructions in paper on precisely what you should include in an EIA and in an EA.
It was always subject to
Yeah.
interpretation by who was doing it. Locally, TxDOT has had a set of FHWA folks that have been there for quite a while, so they know all the stories, all the hidden skeletons in the closets, and it worked with TxDOT pretty well. But going back to like the I-69 corridor, we had this big meeting and took a picture with pins that everybody was going to work together, and it never happened. Everybody still kept to their silos, so to speak.
And there's been agency fighting over the years so as well. It's kind of like the hidden secret. Everybody knows, but no one really talking about it. But I have bumped up against that with a recent project I did where we were not allowed to.
And there's alternatives out there. I'll pick on the ranchers and landowners. For years, TxDOT has had livestock tunnels. If you may not have noticed them, but they go on the highways. And there's a lot of interesting topics about those or discussions. Where we did a expansion in Victoria, we went from 2 lanes to 4 lanes divided with a fairly large grass median. We actually had to come back in and put skylights in the median so that the cattle could see their way through. They were a little nervous going down a dark tunnel. So every project is kind of unique. I spoke to a neighborhood group, and they were talking about a project next to their neighborhood. How long will it take? I said, well, first of all, the weather is one of your bigger factors. But as much surveying, as much research, as much due diligence as you go through, you're not going to know anything until you start opening the ground. And there's no telling what you will find. Again, you can do all the research, all the historical references, and there's unmarked utilities almost in every project. The utilities didn't mark where they were, or they don't know where they are anymore. And there could be some significant utilities, gas lines and high-powered electricity lines, all kinds of things. And then there's some oddities. I know you talked a little bit about the animals and highways. There's a neat story in Bastrop through the Lost Pines area. So Bastrop to LaGrange, if you're familiar with that area, was a 2-lane highway on State Highway 71. When they went to expand it, they discovered that there was an endangered frog, the pine tree frog, in the Lost Pines. So they wanted to look at, after they already had most of the project constructed, they wanted to look at how do we safely get the frogs across the highway, because they were playing Frogger with the cars and getting smushed, and it was an endangered species, and we didn't want to have that. So they put these little tunnels in. Seemed very practical, very smart. Well, what's a predator to a frog? Another reptile, a snake. And they started to occupy the tunnels. So they had to go back and actually close all the tunnels because the snakes thought it was lubies and they were waiting in line for the buffet. So
What did they do as a solution to that?
I think they just let the frogs fend for themselves. Catapults. Any other questions, transportation related or anything? Please.
I have a question. So what's the difference between being an MPO director and then going and being like a director of a section in the DOT? What's the difference from a career perspective as well? And why did you leave?
Well, I left TxDOT in '97, so I started out doing data analysis. So I was out putting out tube counts, reading model outputs, doing turning movements, which I think has given me a good foundation on what is. Because I was out in the field a lot and got to see what people do behind the wheel. There's a couple of professors from A&M, Dr. Gordon Shunk, I think he's still around, was one of them. And they spent years on trying to create these supercomputers to try to simulate what a person does behind the wheel of a car. I think they finally given up. There's just no way to do that. So I started traveling and started working with the MPOs after the ICE-T Act was passed, and Victoria was one of my areas. And I got approached to come down there and be the Deputy Director of Development and be the MPO Director. Also at that time at TxDOT, if you didn't have a PE, there didn't look like there would be a whole lot of advancement. But that changed a lot when I left, and sometimes I regret leaving because I could have gone up the system in TxDOT. But that's why I left TxDOT the first time, and then just changes in life and family, divorce, and all that kind of good stuff. Moved around a little bit. So the other interesting one was being the MPO or the Transportation Director in Baton Rouge. That was a very interesting job as well. But now I'm just working in a little department in the city and still get to do all the same things. Got to go through all the same programs, but just a little bit more refined. So, but still part of the whole. We had a regional arterials conference call today talking about the regional arterial plan for this whole area. So, still involved in all of that. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for you about taking out the Lone Star Rail.
Yes, ma'am.
The long-range plan. It seems to me unusual that an NPO would actually take a deliberate action to remove a project. I mean, most of the time, things just kind of sit in the long-range plan.
As an MPO director, that should be your. And it's not the MPO director, but as the board, just like in Georgetown, I want to look at all modes of transportation and how we can make them interact and work better together. That's a charge of an MPO. So yes, to remove that, but it goes back to all the money that has been spent on studies and engineering and nothing to show on the ground. And the then executive director or head of the Campo board, which I think was a Hays County judge or one of the other judges, they just started to drum up opposition against it, and they were just dead set against it.
So, could you reflect a little bit then on maybe some of the political considerations that would be behind that kind of a decision as opposed to, it would be entirely possible, and many regions do this, they have projects that sit in the long-range plan that are not being acted on.
Correct. As you know, the long-range plan for anywhere it's a ultimate build-out. And of course, there's a lot of things that don't get accomplished. There's still a plan that shows a highway connecting Lakeway through the Balcones Protected Preserve. And in this case, it was just everyone had lost favor with Lone Star Rail and just the project in general. So that was the politics behind it. And then when UP did what they did, it was kind of, well, we spent a couple of months looking at alternate routes. A lot of those took them out. We looked at 130 perhaps. Then you started looking at the connection to 130. How do you get out there? And it just snowballed and went downhill from there. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think of the privatization of the high-speed rail project? Would it make any difference to economics from if it is owned by the state?
I think the privatization is probably the way to go. Again, you can have that project happen a lot faster because you're using private dollars. Nothing against our federal government, but when you start looking at the federal dollars, if there's 1 penny of federal money in a project, then you have to look at going through the whole federal process. So I think getting private investors in here is probably going to be the future for some of the transportation projects. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't really know yet because we haven't had a lot of that in Texas yet. So it's happening, in other places in the nation. I think there's a private individual looking at putting the rail line from Los Angeles to Las Vegas that's going to be privatized. So.
Do you think it will influence people's travel behavior, and do you think it has impact on transportation?
I don't know. I was going to put a slide in here that, the only way we'd have to have a paradigm shift in thinking to really change people's attitudes with driving. Not that Texas is any different. I'm sure it's across the nation like this, but people like that instant reaction that if they need to go somewhere, that the kids are sick, if they need to take off from work, they can jump in their car and go. And that's kind of the thing we're looking at. So it's that last mile, as they've referred to, that last mile trip. How do you get from the high-speed rail to your job or back and forth? And that last mile connection is what's the big missing piece. But it's going to take something like congestion pricing or gas prices go up. You will see mass transit go up when gas prices go up. Or you just sit back and let the system fail. That's the other option. And then people will have to change how they do things. Because
we've been letting, I would argue, we're letting the system fail here in Austin for some
yeah.
years, and we still, our tolerance is a growth. I think it's huge. I mean, we're looking back to A&M Professor.
Yeah.
Predicting how we tolerate stuff.
Yeah.
We're quite
and when people
serious.
ask me about I-35, they go, well, what are y'all going to do to fix this? And it's too late. There's not a damn thing you can do about it.
No, and the commissioner, like Doug Cody was telling me, we were at electing all week, just how fast Georgetown has grown.
It has. And
I mean,
the county, Williamson County, has their own version of Trans-Texas corridors. They want.
I mean, the numbers are staggering.
They are.
Even at your micro level in the city level.
By 2030, we're supposed to double in population. That'll put us over 100,000 in Georgetown. And it's, going back to planning and planning theory, which I'll probably all have touched on and know, if you're achieving 2.5%, 3% growth in your urbanized area or in your city, that's good growth. But since 1992, this whole area, even through the recession, has been seeing 7 to 10% and even higher in different portions. But it's been sustained now for 20 years, and that's unheard of. You can't plan for that. You just kind of have to deal with it as you go. And as I mentioned in my outline, one of the nasty things, or the ugly truth, is you can't build out of congestion. Once it's here, it's here. You can't do anything to build out of it if it costs too much money.
So you were talking about the rail that they're looking into for Dallas, in Houston,
Mm-hmm.
right? You said that they might start construction soon or whatever. How do they deal with I'm just thinking about the people from Texas and their opposition to projects like these, and not necessarily the people that live within the metro area.
Sure.
But those people in between.
In
It's
between.
what is the messaging, or how?
They've done multiple. When I was in the rail division from 2015 to 2016, I didn't go to any of those meetings, but they had public meetings from Bryan College Station and all the small cities. They probably had 10 or more up and down the corridor, and so they try to get the word out. They try to talk to folks, understand their concerns. I think for something to move forward, if the Floor Corporation or however that's going to be funded, that gives them the option to move forward. They can usually offer more than what TxDOT could for buying right-of-way, and that may appease some of the folks. But then they're ultimately looking at maybe having to go to condemnation or something like that, where the state would have to step in to do that. Because the only other person that has condemnation power is the railroads, and why they gave the railroads condemnation power is beyond me. But I think it's going to move forward. Hopefully it will move forward. So, yes, ma'am.
Can you see any way in which building out high-speed rail or rail connections between the metro areas could benefit the areas in between in any ways?
I think
Or-
it could. Again, the whole thing about high-speed rail is getting from point A to point B.
Yeah.
So it just depends on if you're gonna have any stops and how long those stops would be. If there is a urbanized city, say of 10,000 or more, then I could see them having a stop in that location. Just like the Texas Central, they're gonna swing out and catch into College Station with that rail line as well. I think it just depends on how many stops they're looking at and if it's still gonna be efficient to do that. As far as impact to the cities, I don't think they will, because a lot of those cities or smaller cities, they were all built on the freight rail lines. And I think they'll still stay there. They got a pretty good hold.
Great. Could you reflect on further detailed lessons could be learned from the two major failed attempts? One is just a super corridor. Governor Paris with this grand idea, right? It got something out there that's good, but eventually fails. So what could be done differently in order for that idea to fly, or
I
at
think
least
that-
fly longer? And then it's a Lone Star kind of all sorts of factors affecting or leading eventually to the fail. Anything else that can be done?
If a lot of these projects, and I'll start with Lone Star Rail, it needs a champion or a group of champions to march it down. And that's why it was gaining some steam. It did have a group that was pushing it, moving it forward. I think just keeping everybody informed about a project like that and trying to interact with the public as much as possible. But, again, spending all this money and not getting anything accomplished was kind of its downfall. It needed to stay on track. It needed to move forward, and I think in some cases it was probably sabotaged in some respects. People holding on to things, people not wanting to do approvals, not participate. And that's the thing is getting all the players all together at the table, making sure everybody's on the same page so that no one does raise opposition to a project like that. Trans-Texas corridors, it was faulted by the way it was rolled out to the public. It had a lot of, just the way it was presented to the public and how the meetings were held, that was really the big downside of it. It had a lot of merit as creating a thoroughfare plan for the state of Texas. But I think just when people saw the footprint of that super corridor, that's really what brought it down. And then when they were asking questions about it, TxDOT or the consultant parties didn't have any really good answers about it. So it just, trying to get it out to the public and out to the media and out to as many people as possible could be one thing that would help that project again. Something like that will probably come back, just like Lone Star Rail will probably come back. And again, the missing piece is, I don't know if there's any active studies on the east-west corridor for high-speed rail. So that's the other missing piece. There was some talk, I haven't heard of anything that's been initiated yet. So, yes, ma'am.
I can give you two little facts from my experience. If you're going to deal with any of the Class 1 railroads in the United States, there are 7 of them.
Yeah.
UP is one of the hardest nuts to crack if you're going to negotiate with UP. They have top lawyers, so you probably know Catherine Peck.
Yes.
Who from the UTA bring it in Salt Lake City. She's a very, very, very long-term good friend of mine. You have to be ready to negotiate with a Class 1 railroad that has history and provenance within its jurisdiction, and you have to understand that. And you cannot go in and not know your negotiating stuff with them. They are the big kahuna. Most of their lines now, that one particular railroad in the United States, most of its lines in fee simple. Fee simple means you physically own the line. They are not under an easement. They are not subject to what's called reversionary return. So they have a lot of cards in playing that poker game with you that they can play. And you have to understand UP.
They'll tease you along.
And they will. And you have to go and do what I did. I went and spent 2 weeks in UP's headquarters when I wanted them to give me some funding to carry on working on corridor preservation work. You have to get to know them, and you also have to gain their trust. And it took me a long time to gain their trust. BNSF,
18 years.
CSX, and Norfolk Southern, they're easier.
Yeah,
What-
BSNF
I
is.
guess the question is here, if I were UP president or whoever, I would like to see the benefit of carrying the passenger rail in order for me to be interested in this project.
And I will tell you,
So
they-
rather than it's not simply sort of convincing them or playing with their game, to what somehow, some way, kind of like partnership that UP can see the benefit. Otherwise,
Yeah, I mean,
it's
we
tough.
were,
I know it's the it's
I will
easy
tell
to
you
think
from
about
what,
it.
From what I have when I was in them, they don't see a benefit anywhere in sharing their right of way.
Well, then we
I-
probably need to propose Lone Star in a different way. So
and
that,
that's where it was headed. And again, I think if it weren't for the history of Lone Star, it would still be having some traction. It was just the way Campo looked at it, the way a lot of elected officials in the area looked at it was that, again, here we spent millions of dollars and
Right,
we're
right.
nowhere. And
Right.
that was the whole thing that brought that down.
and then the super corridor idea, if we present it in terms of local community or regional benefit or development, rather than just a simple transportation project,
Yeah.
may make a difference in terms of public perception. So, so the you mentioned about champion leadership or championship. Yeah, the champion. Who might be the champion?
I think
Governor Perry, or a person like that, or
it can be.
or a lawyer like Lisa, or like
it
you.
can be, and it can be just in a, depending on the project. It could be a group of individuals. It could be one or two people. Just someone that's got the power to be listened to.
Or Kirk Watson.
Kirk Watson?
Yeah, isn't he? Might be. He once was very active.
He was. Steve
Yeah.
Adler is very active now in all the transportation around
Right.
Austin. So it just takes maybe not one person, but a group.
Right, yeah.
Just really stand behind it and say, this is going to work. But it's all how you present it is the way it starts out. It's very true. The first impression is unfortunately usually a negative impression.
Right.
And it's just how do you get past that? And like I said earlier, I don't think, not just Texans, I don't think people will really look at that until there's a reason to look at it. That means failure of the system.
I think too, Kobe, you know how much time Kobe checks.
Yes.
So Kobe, I was flying with Kobe, because I did TxDOT strategic plan for the first 5 years I was at CTR. And so I had to go visit all the commissioners and division directors and all the DPs to go to the commission. So we were on a plane line, he said to me, he thought the Trans-Texas corridor failed because he said it was like a spine that grew a cancer.
Yeah.
And getting the cancer out of the spine in that surgery is extremely technical, and you have to be at the top. But it was a pretty good analogy. He said what happened was we had House Bill 3588, and then we had the Trans-Texas corridor, and then we had a couple of decisions that were coming up on eminent domain in the courts that were getting the landowners fessed up, which eventually culminated in POV in London. But it was like a trifecta of those things, and you were now having to separate out those components to try and then bring the spine back to being whole. But I thought it was a good analogy. And he had actually done some work for the late Commissioner Rick Williamson, looking at messaging on this.
Yes.
And he had looked back to when the interstates were built back in the 40s and 50s, and there was actually very similar opposition to the interstates, and the sky is falling down.
Yeah, anytime you have any type of large infrastructure project, you run into that battle, and that's private property owners, and just them thinking the sky is falling is a very good analogy to that. In TxDOT, it's winning over the commission, winning over those 4 or 5 individuals that support transportation in the state. It's getting them all on board on a project as well. So it's just dealing with all that. Yes, ma'am.
So the very existence of this center reflects some of the federal government's interest in mega-regional scale planning.
Yes.
And all the initiatives that you covered so nicely this afternoon display this issue of connectivity among metropolitan regions, but within a single state. That happens to be because Texas is so large.
Correct.
So a lot of what you've discussed could be handled just within the state.
Correct.
In other parts of the country, the same issue is not true. And I wonder, in your experience, to what extent are stakeholders looking to the federal government at all in its, I'd say, nascent interest in mega-regional scale issues over the last 10 years or so, looking to the federal government for some more decisive action, for planning support, for maybe administrative or governance mechanisms that would allow larger scale infrastructure planning across state boundaries, across metropolitan regions?
I mean, the federal government's always been in contact. There are those champions of different projects that will go to DC. I went on a few of them where we talked about the state fuel tax or the federal fuel tax, actually. Texas is a donor state, trying to get, we don't get $1 back for every dollar of fuel tax that is collected here. It gets portioned out. I think we get about 80 cents on the dollar, if that. And there have been talks about specific projects, never looking at the whole picture. So there's pieces that people have gone to DC and gotten support for, at least been listened to, but never looking at that whole picture of the mega region itself. I'm sure there has been some discussion, but not a whole lot of it that I'm aware of. And a lot of it is, is a great start, and then for some reason it turns, turns lackluster. It loses its momentum, and there could be a variety of reasons for that.
By the way, this is Dr. Sierra. She is our transportation faculty. Or maybe in Texas someday we have a Senate bill similar to SB 337 in California. Like having this long-term goal or long-term, short-term goal for greenhouse gas emission, and putting some pressure onto local NPOs.
Well, there's even been some legislation talked about electric vehicles. They're using the roadway, but they don't pay a fuel tax. And our cars are getting to some extent better. Our VMT, or vehicle miles of travel, still continue to grow along with the population. So again, it's just that trying to get that paradigm shift and how that happens.
I'm sorry, I'm going to entertain another question. Still, the Texas Central, the Dallas Houston corridor rail is still alive. Good thing. What you think of what might be the threats in the future that could kill the project? Kind of like a potential risk.
I think it goes back to the public outcry, but it seems to have a pretty good momentum right now. So I think unless something changes with that, I think it'll move forward unless there's something from an environmental scale that wasn't looked at originally, or that it was discovered as they start things. But this far along, they shouldn't run into an issue like that.
So environmental, there's potential.
I think once they get that record of decision, if it happens here pretty soon, and they can start construction, then it's going to happen.
And some people are concerned that because for the private investor to earn a profit, eventually, right, they have to earn profit, otherwise they cannot survive. But relying on operating the rail is not going to work. So they have to acquire land and develop properties around the stations, for example,
correct,
corridor, in order to get profit. So that has invited some kind of opposition or concerns.
Yes. Change. Anytime there's change.
It's fine.
Yes, ma'am.
So one thing I've kind of struggled with when we're just talking about regional planning, particularly in Texas, is it seems to inherently prioritize metro areas, and it just seems like a lot of more money, effort, and stuff is being funneled into metro areas, especially as far as like big transportation projects go.
Yes.
Do you think it's possible to balance that and for both rural and metro or urban areas to thrive, or is it sort of time to pick one or the other?
No, there's 25 MPOs in the state of Texas, and we always have these quarterly meetings where we meet and talk. And we always, smaller MPOs, Victoria was only 60,000 at that time. And there's a few other smaller West Texas MPOs as well. And we always would sit around the table, and it was always the Dallas-Houston show. Mm-hmm. Michael Morris, who runs NCT COG, is a big player, and it was always talking about that. And I always used to make the argument, they're high-five interchange cost over $800 million to build. If I had half of that, I could build out my whole network in Victoria and solve all my transportation issues for the next 20 years. But they don't look at it that way. They look at the metropolitan areas, and even highway funding is structured more for those areas as well. So unless there's a change in the bill, the way I look at it, just like with Austin, why waste money? Because you're not solving anything. All you're doing is, for a time being, you're making congestion a little easier to deal with, but ultimately it's going to fail. 183, the open part of 183, which means the untold part from Mopac to 620, is a perfect example. That project took so long, and when it opened for traffic, it was at capacity or failure when it opened for traffic. And it's just the process until they can figure out a better way to implement these large infrastructure, if it's private funding. But yeah, you're right. Spending money on a 8-level interchange in Dallas, there's several areas in the state that could contribute or benefit off of that and contain all their troubles for the next 20, 30 years.
When it's 1:30 now in the morning peak hours, it's already
yes,
packed, jammed.
Unfortunately, I did the original turning movements on that project, but that's exactly how I modeled it. I modeled it after Mopac. I looked at it and said, this isn't going to be a through road. It's going to be a commuter road. And like I-35, that's the big problem with I-35. You have so much through traffic, but then you have everybody using it still for local circulation. Not to mention all the pardon my language, all the damn ramps on it. But that's the problem with I-35, is it's got too much local traffic mixed with a very heavy throughput. And you're seeing that now on 130, and they're putting flyovers now at 290 and 130, and maybe that'll ease some of that as well. But and they'll need to do it at 71 as well, because that's a pretty big bottleneck there in the mornings and in the evenings. Yeah, it's a frustrating going 85 miles an hour and have to come to a screeching halt at 20 miles an hour, and for no reason. You get up there, there's no incident, there's no, just like I-35 here, they've spent years studying why the river and why that curve in I-35 slows everybody down. It's like there's a poltergeist there,
Do you have a theory on that?
I think there's a poltergeist, some kind of being. But you never understand it. Where does it start? And it's there. And if you look at it, there's no accident, there's no nothing. It's just a change in the geometrics of the road, and people like to slow down.
If I was God at 183 or goddess at 183, I would take the developed entrance and exits off. That's a critical juncture at which, like the slinky part of.
I think if they could, like on using I-35 again, if they could deck it from Georgetown to Buda and have completely all through traffic on that, no access, no ramps, that could help a little bit. But you're still looking at the growth and amount of traffic. It's a lost cause. But we'll keep throwing billions at it.
How do you think we could message the congestion charging part of the equation, which at some point we're probably going to end up being tolling part of the equation, or even the putting up the gas part of the equation? Have you ever given any thought to that?
No,
process?
I think it has to start with our legislature and getting them all on board. The whole toll road aspect, and part of that was the Trans-Texas corridor set such a bad taste in everybody's mouth that it's just been hard to come back from that. And as you know now, in our legislature, there's more and more bills coming out to control what local entities can do. They're hammering cities and what cities can do, and some of the state agencies. And I hear that they want to take TCEQ under sunset now because of some contamination out in Colorado County and some other things. So I think it's starting with our legislators and trying to, again, get those champions. Rick Williamson was a great champion of transportation. The senator from El Paso is pretty passionate about transportation, but it's just getting everybody together. So.
And that was my other comment. I mean, part of the TTC book too was the late Williamson, because while he was a champion, he had this black book ideas. So he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd write an idea down. And Cody had told me about this black book, and I'm like, he's just mucking around with me. And second time I went in to see Rick, brought the black book out and started to give me some of his ideas, and I'm like, it's true. But if Rick Williamson didn't like you, oh boy,
Yeah.
God help you. He was a hate him or a love him kind of person, and he could be rude, opinionated, a bully. He'd been a state legislator for 10 years and then was on the commission. Yeah, he was a self-made man. He grew up in a trailer in Arkansas. So he was a a multifaceted, complex person.
Correct.
What a politically correct person would call him. I mean, he would call CTO and say, "Send the English woman down." I didn't like down name, and I would dutifully go down. And so to irritate the fact, I would only call him Commissioner Williams, who was stroking insane. But he was that type of person, so he didn't help the transaction or either
No.
on the messaging front.
There's I made some handouts, overmade handouts, but it's got kind of my outline and my presentation. I'll leave some business cards on the table. Please, if you have questions or would like some help on research or just some candid advice, then please give me a call, shoot me an email. I'll be glad to respond to you. So, thank you for your time.